Cahokia, Societal Collapse or Cultural Evolution, written and narrated by Stephen Leslie. Historian Jared Diamond has identified that civilizations have a set shelf life. He explains how all over the globe, civilizations have risen and fallen based on their exploitation and degradation of their own resources, and then the subsequent wasting of the forests and soils of their conquered territories. These empires appear to simply run out of solutions to solve the magnitude of problems that inevitably arise in complex stratified societies. 500 years seems to be about the norm. The industrial growth civilization has now gone completely global, and the signs are everywhere that its factory farm systems are on the verge of collapse. At this juncture in history, with the rise of neoliberal capitalism and the primacy of the corporation, we now have a global civilization running out of soil and running out of time. In 2014, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimated that at current rates of soil degradation, we have had less than 60 harvests left to us. Agriculture, as it has developed over the last 12,000 years by major world civilizations, has had devastating consequences, but all of it pales in the face of the last 75 years of industrial agriculture. The current industrial ag model is nothing short of a war on nature and is squeezing the life out of the world's soils. Indigenous people lived and farmed the same places on this continent for thousands of years. During the Mayan Classic period, water was managed using advanced systems of check dams and plaster-lined reservoirs to capture the abundance during the rainy season, and this was then fed into the raised beds of the Chinampas during the dry times through the systems of stonework canals. The nutrient-rich muck that collected in the canals was periodically layered onto the beds to maintain their fertility. Fields laid out in furrow and trough systems also utilized irrigation in a similar fashion. On the uplands, the Mayan farmers tended terraced gardens where they built up deep, loamy soils over centuries. When the great Mesoamerican civilizations did hit overshoot, they course corrected and wove that ethic of reciprocity and balance with Mother Earth back into their cultural fabric. Today, the Maya are the living representatives of a continuous cultural transmission that extends back at least 5,000 years. We have it from both the stories of the descendants whose ancestors survived it and from the archaeological record that several great civilizations rose and fell on the continent of Turtle Island prior to the arrival of the European colonizers. The classic Maya, the Toltecs, and many other advanced societies, such as the ancestral Puebloans of the Southwest and the Mound Builders of the Mississippi Valley, all appear to have underwent some kind of colossal overshoot of their environment, quite probably related to shifts in climate that brought drought at a time when large urban populations had become dependent on the cultivation of maize. For spans of 1,000 years or more, each of these ancient societies had great success farming maize, squashes, gourds, beans, sunflowers, and a host of tubers, seed crops, and medicinal plants that were all harbored within the Three Sisters polyculture. They conscientiously wildcrafted for food and medicine they did not grow, always leaving more than they took. They sustained large, well-organized, and highly creative urban populations. But at certain moments, an increased reliance on maize and the associated loss of tree cover may have altered local weather patterns by disrupting small rain cycles, and most certainly bumped up against contrary trends in longer-term climate variations. Depleted soils are more vulnerable to extremes of weather and especially prone to drought. In the vicinity of the great ceremonial mound center of Cahokia, in a riparian zone known as the American Bottom, in present-day southwestern Illinois, The archaeological record shows that as generations of the people became more dependent on maize as a staple, their average weight and height declined. Their bones weren't as strong, and their teeth showed signs of excessive wear and decay. In the beaded burial mound 72, over a span of 2 centuries, 270 bodies were interred. The first bodies discovered by archaeologists were apparently robust-bodied royals, both males and females, dressed in elaborate ceremonial garb with a wealth of finely crafted beads, shell-adorned capes, and exquisite tri-notched arrowheads napped out of quartz, plus expertly crafted tempered pottery with distinctive etched and painted motifs. In succeeding layers, there are found scores of maidens in mass graves who seem to have died in ritual sacrifice. The last burials are of men and women who appear to have been killed in a violent altercation. Cahokia was the largest city and ceremonial mound center of the Mississippian culture that flourished in the eastern half of the continent between 800 and 1600 Common Era. At the peak of its florescence around the year 1100, Cahokia was a bustling metropolis with a population of 15,000, rivaling the city of London. The largest of the earthen mounds, known as Monk's Mound after a community of French Trappist monks who had briefly occupied the site between 1809 and 1813, had a base larger than the Great Pyramid at Giza and was over 100 feet high. A calendar site reminiscent of Stonehenge, known as a woodhenge, was constructed out of poles cut from full-grown trees, suggesting that Cahokia was a ceremonial site and hosted pilgrims from far and wide. The city featured sophisticated urban planning. Causeways linked domiciles, placed in ordered groupings around a central plaza. Each neighborhood even had its own ceremonial sweat lodge. On the flattened grass plain in the city center, a ritualized game using chunky stones and hurling sticks was played. The technology of bow and arrow was first adopted by Eastern woodland cultures around 700 CE, replacing the ancient atlatl or spear thrower. This innovation would have greatly increased access to large game and ready sources of protein. But agriculture was undoubtedly the cornerstone that sustained large populations at Cahokia for over 4 centuries. Several domesticated seed and starchy root crops were also sown that were remnants of the earlier eastern woodland food complex. But once maize was introduced, it became the staple food. A variety of squashes and gourds were produced, but curiously, beans were not in evidence. The rich alluvial soils of the Mississippi floodplain provided the ideal setting for farming at large scale, and the surrounding woodlands were replete with game, fish, and a wide variety of foraged foods. Dry storage pits were constructed throughout the city to keep parched maize and other foods. The city was also a trade hub, exchanging goods, ideas, and foodstuffs along trade routes that extended thousands of miles, influencing the woodland cultures to the east, the tall grass prairie to the west, reaching to the Great Lakes region in the north, and even as far as the Pueblo societies in the southwest. The ability to store surplus food led to the formation of social hierarchies, whose practical function was to manage the distribution of food. Between 800 and 1200 CE, the climate in the American bottom region had been unusually warm and wet. Beginning in the 13th century, a cooling trend precipitated what climate scientists refer to as the Little Ice Age. This period covered the next several centuries when the whole North Atlantic region turned cooler and drier. It was in this period that Viking settlers had to abandon their farms in Greenland, and new ships from the Danes stopped arriving in the ports of Iceland. The confluence of a large population, climate-driven stressors on maize production systems, and overall deteriorating environmental conditions from resource extraction resulted in the gradual realization that the city-state model of Cahokia could no longer be sustained. An obvious sign of increasing scarcity at Cahokia is the appearance of palisades erected around the main ceremonial center. These stockade fortifications in themselves required enormous quantities of trees to be felled for poles, only adding to the problem of resource depletion and drought. Although there is no evidence that Cahokia was ever attacked by a competing city-state or other large enemy force, the mere fact of the rising need for defense speaks volume about changes in the social and political climate as well. The decline and eventual abandonment of Cahokia happened over a period of 100 years and appears not to have been a single catastrophic event, but rather to have been a conscious and intentional shift. By 1300 CE, everyone had up and left. However, the Mississippian culture did not disappear. It changed and it continued to evolve. After the abandonment of the densely populated urban center, people returned to living more simply and in smaller groups. Their culture was still deep and complex, and if anything, their technology became more advanced because it was tempered and nuanced, more sophisticated and subtle. The result was a renaissance of procreative interface with habitat, building on an unbroken cultural heritage extending back thousands of years, really to the time of the Ice Age. No longer living in urban centers with great stores of surplus maize, the people left behind a society of class stratification, returned to egalitarian forms of self-governance based on a more authentic worldview, what today we might call a truly ecological economy, one that was innately attuned to carrying capacity. The archaeological record suggests that after the climate stabilized, the region still supported significant populations. But the confederation of tribes that emerged after the dissolution of Cahokia developed a more fluid subsistence pattern of dispersed farming villages combined with seasonal movement associated with hunting, trapping, fishing, and foraging. They used controlled burning to encourage habitat suitable to buffalo. At the time of European contact, the Illinois Confederation was a thriving and populous nation of tens of thousands of people. Today, the descendants of Cahokia are among the numerous tribes dislocated to the Indian territories of Oklahoma and Nebraska, including the nations of the Peoria, Osage, Pawnee, Shawnee, and Chickasaw. The mastery of survival skills and sensitive persuasion upon landscapes sustained tens of millions of people in the Americas, with estimates of North American population of between 30 to 50 million. When the Europeans arrived, the land appeared to them a trackless wilderness. It was also easier to justify occupying land if one maintained the lie that it was empty. Most amazing of all, more than 500 years after the conquest of Turtle Island began, indigenous peoples across the continent continue to this day to care for land and preserve the ancient wisdom of their ancestors. The people indigenous to this land evolved a pan-cultural ethic of living in balance with the ecological reality of the natural world. Through practice in teaching and ceremony, they continue to pass on to their children the wisdom of living in right relation with the earth. Europeans claimed that natives had no written language. They didn't recognize the writing embedded in the design of their homes, their clothing, beadwork, weaving, basketry, pottery, birch bark inscriptions, animal hide and rock wall paintings, ceremony, dance, and song. All the many ways indigenous people braid their legends, history, and wisdom teachings into the artifacts that come from their hands. Neither could the Europeans read how that same script was written into the fabric of the living landscape. Their ears could not hear that the language of the land was spoken by the people who had always lived there. A people to whom giving thanks is the original gesture. A people for whom considering impacts on future generations is fundamental to group decision-making. With the exception of the far north, nearly every indigenous society on Turtle Island has practiced some form of agriculture. Corn, squash, and bean seeds were adapted to grow in a wide swath of microclimates, from the deserts of the Southwest to the high plains and the northern forest, and from the deep South to the coasts of Maine. Everywhere they lived, the people of Turtle Island practiced an ethic of touching the land lightly. They followed instructions passed down from the ancestors, sacred teachings received from the Creator. Above all else, they valued the knowledge of how to live well while having a minimal impact on the environment. They demonstrated a cultural proclivity toward ecological, complex system of thinking in which all the parts are understood in terms of their relationship to the whole. Although there is no specific ethnographic record of an oral tradition referring directly back to the colossal rise and fall of Cahokia, the stories and myths of the Eastern woodland people are replete with cautionary tales about the negative consequences that befall upon all beings when the behavior of human beings falls out of bounds with the creation. The indigenous people of this land learned how to creatively adapt and survive skillfully in virtually every ecosystem, honoring and preserving their world for future generations through the expression of regenerative cultural norms. Of course, human beings everywhere have problems. We make problems for ourselves. But there is some evidence to suggest that when a society as a whole embraces an ethic of reciprocity with the natural world, human beings can live well and sustain cultural norms that are able to persist and evolve as long as the earth and the mountains shall endure.